welcome to another episode of Why Can't We Talk About It? My name is Danny.
And I'm Jocelyn.
And you are listening to episode 7 of our podcast. And today's topic is, I know we say it's interesting a lot, but it actually is pretty interesting. The topic is on friendship breakups. For me personally, this was definitely a topic that Jocelyn had approached to say, hey, maybe this is something we can talk about because, one, it's interesting. And I would say definitely there is obviously personal aspects to it. But for me, I was like, okay, that's interesting because, of course, when I think about breakups, it's typically just romantic breakups and, those kind of relationships. So the idea that it's about friendships, it's a bit different. And it definitely is something that I think I had to really think about to be like, oh, has this affected my life and do I have experiences in it? However, I think we will definitely delve into it and it'll be a good one.
That's exactly why I wanted to bring it up, because when you think of the term breakup, you do think of your romantic relationships. You don't necessarily think about your friendships. Also, I'm going to title this episode 7, Friendship Breakups, ... It's interesting. Quoting you, Danny. I also have specific personal experiences that I will share, but just overall, I think it's important for us to talk about this more because friendship breakups, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people listening, and particularly a lot of women listening, friendship breakups can be just as painful, if not more painful, than a romantic relationship ending. But we don't really give ourselves the space to sort of grieve the end of that relationship. And depending on how the relationship ended, the friendship, it can be awkward to sort of share that with other friends. It's hard to know who to turn to. So I think this is one of those things that we should be talking about a bit more. So maybe I'll start, Danny, and I'll talk about how I view friendship. So I have always been a girl's girl. Like, it's very important for me to have female friendships. I put a lot of time and care into cultivating the friendships that I have in my life. I think it's important to spend time nurturing those relationships. So for me, when there's a fracture or a shift in a friendship, that's just as impactful as if something is going wrong with me and Azim. So I've always had best friends, and I've always had a little bit wider of a circle of friends, I think, than is typical. And throughout my 20s, that circle has sort of become a little bit smaller and a little bit stronger too, I want to say. I think when a major friendship breakup happened for me, it was in my early 20s. That's pretty typical. I think, when you're doing that shift from being a teenager to discovering yourself, discovering what your values are, maybe changing lifestyle, it's pretty normal that you then also change the people you hang out with. I've read that another time when you sort of lose friends is when you get married. That hasn't happened to me because I think I do put time into trying to keep my friends. But basically, anytime you experience like these big life shifts, like getting married, having kids, becoming an adult, you do sort of shift or lose friends. For my personal experience, my friend breakup was, I call it like a bad breakup because it wasn't one of those like gradual, oh, we just don't have as much in common and we're canceling on each other and we just grow apart and we're still friends on Facebook, so it's not awkward if we say happy birthday here and there. Like that, I don't consider that necessarily a friendship breakup. That's just growing apart, right? I'm talking about a breakup where myself and the other person were not on the same page with what our relationship was like. And I think this is also why friendship breakups are particularly painful, because when you're dating someone, you go in with a set of expectations. Like with romantic relationships, there are norms, so to speak, right? Like what to expect. With friendships, I think it's a little bit more fluid, and that's not always communicated. And I think it's particularly painful if one person is expecting more from you than you can give them.
Mm-hmm.
What happened in this particular friendship is we met at a time in our lives where I was pretty young. I was like, I think 18 or 19. I had gone through a bad relationship breakup with my high school boyfriend. And this person really helped me through that. They had so much wisdom to share, and they gave me the exact distraction I needed. They were really good at making me see the carefree side of life. We partied a lot. We did a lot of getaways.
Nice.
They really helped me through that time. And I think I helped them as well with their own particular problem. You can tell I'm being really generic because not that person's going to listen to this podcast, but I don't think it's fair to share their side of the story. And there is always three sides to a story, right? My side, your side, and the truth. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to be as fair as possible. So anyway, this was a really strong friendship. I was at that point in my life, I was totally expecting this friendship to last forever. It was like kismet. We just had so much in common and same sense of humor, just so many of the same interests. It really was awesome. But then as I grew up, I met Azim. I started university and my values sort of shifted. And I'd realized things like I didn't like the person I was when I was hanging out with that person. Mm-hmm. And I found that our conversations were more and more about that person complaining about certain things, maybe other relationships in that person's life. It just felt like a lot of negativity. And I would start to dread having to meet up with that person. So I had actually dabbled in therapy at this point. I think I mentioned in our first episode that I had like certain things that I went to therapy for. This was one of them. I haven't shared that before, but navigating how to get through this relationship was something I talked about in therapy. Now, I actually don't think that this was handled well on my part, and it's almost like we should have gone to couples therapy. And you know what? That's the thing. Like friendship therapy is actually a thing. But anyway, I don't want to digress. So I personally don't think I handled the end of this friendship very well. Mm-hmm. I had a really hard time setting boundaries. And instead of voicing the fact that I didn't like that this person spoke a certain way about people, or that I didn't hold the same values as this person when it came to ethics and morals, instead of standing up and saying, I disagree with what you're saying here, I would try to support her and be on her side when she would bring up problems. I think that if I had been a bit braver and said, you know what, I don't think this situation in your life is entirely that person's fault. I think that you could be doing X, Y, Z, and maybe giving that person some tough love would have gone a long way in fixing some of the fractures that had happened. But instead, I felt like what they really needed was just somebody to be a yes person and support them. So my therapist noticed that I just didn't feel like I could stand up for myself in this relationship. And she suggested breaking up with that friend in a letter, because she said, you're not going to be able to voice everything as articulately as you're saying to me right now. And you like writing. So why don't you write this letter and send it to her? And essentially, that was like breaking up over text, and I wish I hadn't done that because that person's response was super defensive. I don't think they were hearing what I was trying to say. And looking back on it, I think it's because, understandably, I had been a yes person, agreeing with everything they were saying for so long. And then kind of out of nowhere, although I will say I was like slowly like trying to distanced myself from them. So it wasn't like I was seeing this person every week and then like, okay, I can't be friends with you anymore. It wasn't like that. It was like actually after periods of like we hadn't talked in like months, then this happened. So yeah, I sent the letter via email, and that person responded in a really defensive way, wasn't hearing any of the points I was making. And I took that as a sign of like, okay, I made the right decision by not keeping this person in my life. When I look back, I wonder if I had been able to have these hard conversations with that person sooner, or maybe even have that breakup be in person, would things have turned out differently? I don't necessarily regret it. I do think it was a pretty involved relationship. I think it required more than I could give.
Yeah.
I look back with so much fondness for this person. There are things that will always remind me of them. And like, I'm at the point now where I can look at those memories and laugh, and like, it doesn't hurt, because they really are a good person. It just we weren't a good fit at that point. It definitely hurt. Like, that left a gap. It was such a unique friendship. I think there will always be a gap in my life for the way that friendship was. And I can only imagine how much it hurt them. It was pretty bad. Luckily, we didn't have tons of mutual friends. So it wasn't awkward. Like, I didn't have to like run into mutual acquaintances and like have that be a thing. It was sort of just like the painful unfollowing on social media, and then that was it.
I kind of want to ask, what's the stretch of time from how long ago did you know this person, and then how much time had passed before you're like started recognizing something less, such as like, oh, you kind of recognize that, hey, your values have kind of changed, whether it's values or grow up and get older, but maturity happens too. And, you know, you said you noticed that when you hang out, you kind of revert back to a time where you didn't really like how you were, and in order to be like, you know, friends with that person. And then eventually you write the letter, send the email and so forth, and things kind of end. How much time are we talking about?
Yeah, it was a few years into the friendship. Like, we had a really solid relationship for a while, like 3 or 4 years. The catalyst actually was that I made a new best friend. I don't think she'd mind me naming her. But when I went to France for my study abroad, I had a roommate. Her name was Laura. We just met. We both went to Ryerson, but we had never met before because we were in different programs. And being the super organized person that I am, and she's the same way, we wanted to get our housing situation all sorted, like way ahead. And so we met via email and then met up on campus and decided that we were a good fit to live together. And it was, again, sort of that same immediate chemistry where we were just such fast friends. I always joked that she was like my wife at the time, because we would do everything together. Like, on exchange, people knew that it was Laura and Jocelyn. Like, we did everything together. Like, if I had a different class schedule than her, she'd wait for me to come home and like have dinner together. It was really, really sweet. And I think it was being with her and understanding like how much our values fit with each other. And I felt so comfortable with her. I realized that I wasn't feeling that way anymore with this other friend.
Yeah.
And that was really like the catalyst.
I'm a little bit curious about the part where you kind of talk about, I want to ask, even though you say, yes, values changed and so forth, how did you notice that though? Was it just like over time, small thing, just like you're like, it feels kind of odd to be around this person? Or does someone do something where you're like, hey, this seems wrong and I don't know if this is the kind of person I want to be around? Or was it more like something slow and organic where it just slowly became like, hey, this doesn't seem right, and you didn't look forward to it?
No, it was a couple things that happened that I don't think I'm going to share.
Oh, okay. Okay, so
but that
happened,
yeah,
like very
that
specific
person,
things.
yes, that person treated somebody else in their life in a way that I just couldn't get behind, and I felt like a fraud, being like, oh no, it's okay that you did that.
Okay, so that's interesting. Okay, yeah, no, you don't have to get into the details or anything like that, but I guess I just wonder how that works, because like I know you have this example, and as you're talking about this, and even when you brought up this topic as an idea, I was kind of trying to like Rolodex through my life and be like, did I go through something similar? I'm going to say no. I actually don't think that I did. My group of friends is kind of the same group I've had for a long time. Like even in my current group of friends, one of them, I've known him since grade 5.
Wow.
Most of them are actually from high school. And so it's still the same friends. And even, I guess, if I extend that circle out from the immediate circle out a little bit, that circle of friends is still mostly elementary school. Maybe I just didn't really care for university. So maybe that's why I didn't really like hang out there enough to like really get to know people. But when I think about friends that have kind of drifted apart, I don't really have examples of, oh, something very specific happened, and so therefore we don't really want to be friends anymore. I think for most people, they just kind of drift apart because, like you said, whether they have relationship changes, change was once everybody started going to like post-high school, where they went to school. One big difference I would say, between you and I, you say there is a purpose for you when it comes to cultivating your relationships. And so you're putting in that effort to try and keep that stuff going. And I find in my experience, it tends to be if you already have similar interests, then you're most likely going to do that anyways. It does take effort if you want to keep certain relationships going, but you don't run in that same circle. So I think it's a bit different. However, there was one, it didn't happen to me, but I remember there was this high school class that I was in, one of the classes, and I remember there's these two girls who sat one in front of each other, and I thought they were like good friends because every day I see them talking and they were hanging out until one day. And this is what I think of when you say friendship breakup. One of them said to the other, she goes, "Hey, we can't be friends anymore. We can't talk to each other anymore. You're way too much of a distraction for me for school. I need to study."
Whoa.
And I was like, oh my goodness, this is so straightforward.
Wait, she did this publicly?
Yeah, I was in class. I was there. Yeah.
Aww.
Like, it wasn't like a loud spectacle or anything. It was definitely like, I sat, I think, like one or two desks in front of them. So I heard that and I was like, oh, wow. Unfortunately, I think the other person was, upset about it.
Oh, she's in therapy for sure, or she should be. That core memory. Yeah,
core memory. This is like grade 9, I think.
Ouch.
But I remember just thinking, I'm like, oh, wow, I never seen I knew it wasn't a romantic relationship. It was a friendship. But it's like, oh, I've never actually seen that happen before. It was definitely what I think of when we talk about the term friendship breakup. And so kind of just coming back a little bit more to my personal experiences, though, it's like, yeah, I didn't really have anything necessarily like that. I could think of one person, though, where although we were friends, it wasn't like over time things happened where I was like, oh, this person did something bad to somebody and I didn't like it. It to me felt more like an organic, like, I don't really necessarily care to hang out with this person. But sometimes for me, like when I think about that, I go, it's not like something like I didn't do anything and she didn't do anything to do that. It's just like I think over time, sometimes your point about values, you kind of realize like, you know what? I don't think we had the same mentality, same values of life and hanging out. And so hanging out just doesn't feel great anymore. Mm-hmm. Over time, I think that's how a lot of time people drift apart. And I can remember maybe like one or two where those examples happened where I go, you know what, this person is kind of going one direction. I'm going one direction. And the things they want to do aren't the same things that I want to do. And so it's like, do you really care to hang out anymore? But I think at the same time, sometimes that's hard to let go of.
Yeah.
When I can't speak for the other people, but when you kind of start realizing, you're like, oh, I don't think we're going to be friends anymore because I just don't think I want to. But but at the same time, it's confusing because for me, I go, it's not like anything happened. Sometimes I think about those kinds of friendships and I go, oh, I wonder if that's like, for that moment, what would it be like if we're still friends? But it's something I don't think people really discuss because it's like, oh, it's kind of an odd thing to try to pinpoint what went wrong if there wasn't anything that necessarily sticks out. So do you have that?
I don't really see that as particularly painful. It's definitely hard. I think, like, to your point, when you look at that friendship and you're like, oh, I guess we're not friends anymore. Like, you can't use that title anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit of a pang. But I think I kind of look back at those friendships as like a really beautiful time in my life, and I can appreciate them for what they were. And as long as it was like a mutual, both of us drifting apart, I don't put too much stock into it. I think that's a normal part. I don't know if you've heard the quote, friends are in our life for, or people are in your life for a reason, a season, or a lifetime.
Oh yeah, I have.
So yeah, sometimes, people come in and out. They were there for a season. I think it's okay. I think that happens. But I think it's so important for those close friendships in your life. Like, it takes work, right? It's as much as we look at our friends as a reprieve, maybe like our soulmates, our, the people that we go to have a good time, to support us through the bad times. You have to know that all of that connective tissue doesn't get there without support and putting work into maintaining the friendship. And I just don't think that that's acknowledged enough, because we put work into our romantic relationships. We put a lot of our emotional energy into our vocation, like our careers, our kids, our family life. But friends, we sometimes almost take it for granted that they are there and that we think, they'll always be there. But I think that it takes work, and we should be putting aside emotional energy for our friendships as well.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good point, because I think most people probably do take it for granted. I've definitely heard stories of, friendships that end didn't take much. It doesn't have to take much, I don't think, for that to happen. I think it's important that, yes, I think it's great to be able to cultivate that. But I think just being aware that, like, hey, a friendship isn't just, it's there just cause. Like, there's a reason that it's there. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, that you still, like, treat your friends well and stuff like that, just as you would with, like, whether it's a partner, the importance for a career and so forth. And one aspect, actually, I think that, you brought up, just kind of going back to your first story, where you kind of wondered if instead of sending an email, that conversation actually happened. I don't know that person, but in my mind, I'm like, well, if they were defensive over an email, maybe in person, it would have been kind of similar. But I guess my point of this whole thing is more like, sometimes these conversations could be helpful, because even in friendships, relationships, if people aren't really saying what's on their mind, if they aren't talking to each other and assumptions are being made, I think sometimes those things can kind of put a dent into friendships as well. I've definitely seen that happen with others. I think I've dealt with that too, where, people just kind of don't voice what's on their mind, and it turns out someone's unhappy about something and people kind of fester on that. So I've dealt with that too in friendships. And then eventually you find out why someone's so upset, and you're like, oh, okay, well, let's talk about that and we'll figure out what's going on and you can fix things.
It's hard to come back from that if you let it fester for too long, though, So I think it's, keeping that line of communication open. Like, the relationship may never be the same, and that in itself can be really heartbreaking.
True. Would you argue, though, that it's definitely better at some point, though, to put that out there?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah?
Yeah, I agree with that for sure.
Yeah, it's different now. I do think age matters too, right? Like, if you're talking about early 20s versus people in their 30s and so forth. But then again, I've heard stories of people who are much older who still hang on to that kind of stuff. So maybe not. Maybe age is not really a real indicator here.
But you know what? Going through these major life changes. So I mentioned at the beginning, like, going from teens to early 20s was like a big reset in personal development. I think at this time, with friends getting married, my friends are just starting to have kids, and we're going through another shift where it's kind of like, okay, we're in totally different stages of our life, and there are things that we may not relate to each other about anymore. And I want to be conscious of making sure that I'm still giving that same amount of attention to the friend. I don't want it to drift apart just because that person has had a child or that person has gotten married. And So that's something now in our late 20s, early 30s, even mid 30s. I think I like to remind myself of that because it can be so much easier to be like, oh, this person is probably too busy. I'll send this like link I want to share like this to my other friend who I don't think is as busy.
Yeah.
I think we shouldn't make assumptions. We should always keep those lines of communication open and know that at the end of the day, like any good thing, it takes work and it should take work because it's worth holding on to.
Do you have advice? Because I think in our conversations over the last few episodes, and just me knowing you as well, one thing that you definitely have said is you do make it a point to cultivate your relationships. You know, when it comes to just friendships and, you know, you saying that earlier too, could you maybe break down a little bit of like what exactly that means? What do you do? What does that look like where you are mindfully making sure and cultivating your friendships?
I don't know if I can be the friendship guru. I definitely think I can be a lot better in certain departments.
Uh-huh.
As we're having this conversation, I'm like, oh my gosh, I haven't texted these 3 people in a while and I want to make sure I check in on them. I think it is that it's as simple as scheduling time into my calendar for my friends. Even if it's not us actually hanging out, I need to make sure that I put reminders in like friendship time and like just send a few texts and make sure everyone's doing well. I like to send out snail mail. That's a very personal thing though. That's like something I love to do. So I like to send cards and stuff just to say I'm thinking of you. And yeah, making sure that if it has been a little bit too long between catch-ups with my closest girlfriends, that I check in and say like, you know, no pressure, just want to make sure everything's going well. And more often than not, we just need to hop on the phone and have a good catch up. It's really just that simple. I think it's just prioritizing time for friends. I also have to say, I have found that my friendships have improved when I've been open about struggling with depression and anxiety, because definitely the first thing to suffer is my relationships, because I pull into myself, I don't reach out, and I feel so much guilt around not being there for people or canceling plans or just not being up to it. So I think being open and saying, you know, my mental health isn't great, so I'm really sorry, I can't make it, or XYZ. And also similarly having that same outlook for my friends. Like I have a couple friends who have anxiety or maybe other mental health conditions, and just keeping an open mind and knowing from their end that, you know, they're not canceling because they don't want to see me or they're trying to inconvenience me or whatever.
Yeah.
I think keeping that open mind as well, so that my friends know it's a no judgment zone for that, is important. I think there are friendship experts out there. I don't want to, I'm not an advice giver, like I said, but if anybody wants to, you know, delve into friendship a little bit more, as I think we all should, because I think the older we get, the fewer friends we seem to have. That's just the nature of friendships. I look at like my parents and stuff like that, and their friendship circles are definitely smaller than when they were younger.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't want that to happen to me. I'd love to keep my circle of friends, and lots of studies show that the happiest people when they're older are the people who have those close friendships in their life. So I'll recommend a book. It's called Big Friendship, and it's by Aminatou, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Anne Friedman. They wrote a book. They actually started a podcast first. They had a rift happen in their friendship, and they wrote a book about it and how they, like what it was like going through that and how they came out the other side. And it was just so eye-opening and vulnerable, and it gave me a lot of hope. And I think it really instilled the message in me that, you know, we should be putting just as much work into our friendships as we do our romantic relationships. So I definitely recommend giving that a read. It's a good one.
Yeah, I think friendships, even though we started off this podcast talking about friendship breakups, I actually think it's good to actually talk about too that, you know, friendships are important. I can't remember, this is can't remember this correctly, but it's like you're the average of like your closest friends or closest however many friends. And, when I think about that, I'm like, yeah, that sounds about right. I am probably an average of my closest friends. Another thing I remember is that as someone who does therapy, I remember the very first session I ever had with my therapist. She asked me the question of like, do you have a friend group? Like, do you have friends?
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of like laughed a little bit because I was like, well, yeah, I do. Why do you ask? And she did kind of explain like, yeah, it's important that you have a circle of friends and people you can interact with, speak with, and so forth. It kind of made me wonder though later when I think back on that experience and that session, I go, I wonder if she's asking because there are people maybe don't have that. I am lucky to have the friends that I have. It doesn't really occur to me to think like, oh, what if I weren't friends with these people or not have friends? I do think about like, yeah, there are probably people out there who don't have that kind of group, whether it's just friends, support group, family, and so forth. And so I know I'm very lucky to have these people around, even though especially with COVID and life transitions and so forth, that we're not seeing each other as much or talking to each other as much. But the fact that they're still there when you need them, I think it's actually a very lucky thing and not to be taken for granted.
Totally agree. I love my friends. I love you guys, any of you who are listening. That makes me think of maybe a new topic that we can talk about in another episode if people are interested, but making friends as an adult. So just going back to something you said, Danny, before we wrap this up, that your circle of friends has remained the same since you were young. I think that's incredible. I noticed a really big difference there between us with that because I think just for a number of reasons. I moved around a lot during elementary school and into middle school. My family moved to different countries. So that's one thing that sort of, interrupted me keeping friendships from when I was really young. Also, I've now moved to a new city and had to make new friends. And it's been so interesting navigating how do we make friends as an adult, and in some ways it feels very much like dating. It also kind of feels like elementary school. I just met somebody recently and literally she was like, do you want to be my friend? It was really like, how else do we do it, But I think that might be something interesting to explore is making new friends as an adult and what's involved in that. I think you and I are a good example of that too, Danny, because we have only become really close friends very recently. So we can delve into that. But I think that's a topic that a lot of people would be interested in. It's hard to navigate. Yeah, making new friends as an adult. It's totally different.
We'll table that, I think, and we'll go through that. Because even just right now, if I just go off the top of my head, I go, okay, all my friends are basically either in school, or from work. And I'm like, where else do you make friends? I'm like, where else? Yeah. Right. So, okay, let's do that. We'll put that on the agenda, I think. And it's definitely if people want to listen to that. Or I have a feeling people are going to have some good thoughts and opinions on that for those who are listening for that topic as well. So, yeah, I think that'll be something that I will look forward to for us to discuss.
Okay, let's end it here. I feel like, Danny, our endings are so rambly. So I'm going to make us end it in like 2 sentences or less. So my ending is, please go subscribe to our Instagram. It's at Why Can't We Podcast. And I have a blog that you can follow. It's in the show notes. And that's it.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, listen to what Jocelyn says because that's all I got as well. So I think this is a great way for us to end it. Nice, short and sweet.
Okay. Talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.